Let me introduce our stellar guest this evening, Lord Peter Lilley, who was initially elected as a Conservative Member of Parliament back in 1983. He was then the MP for St Albans. There were some boundary changes, so from 1997 onwards, he became the MP for Hitchin and Harpenden. I think that included about 2/3 of his previous constituency. As well as a reputation as an excellent local constituency MP, of course, he had a stellar career on the Green benches, served as a cabinet minister in the governments of Margaret Thatcher and John Major, and as deputy leader of the Conservative Party under William Hague. He was elevated to the Lords in 2018, serving on the Select Committee for the EU Internal Market, then the Environmental and Climate Change Committee until 2024, and he's currently on the Financial Services Regulation Committee. It's fair to say that Peter is a long-standing Eurosceptic. He strongly supported Brexit. He's also been a long-term critic of mass migration and is a renowned critic of climate change policy, or at least the one that we've been adopting to date. In fact, he was one of just 5 members of Parliament to oppose the Climate Change Act in 2008, it says here. One of only 5. Peter, it's wonderful to have you with us. Thanks so much. Looking forward to hearing your wisdom and common sense. Really grateful for you make the time to join us this evening.
Great pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting me.
I wonder if we can kick off, Peter, on a very topical matter, which is the New Deal between Britain and the EU that the Prime Minister signed yesterday. Is Brexit now unravelling at speed? Is this the first step to get us back into the EU or into the EU orbit? What do you make of the deal that the Prime Minister has signed?
Didn't think he would come up with such a bad deal, even from his own perspective. It's so devoid of anything very solid, and it gives away an awful lot which people will be able to see as being given away. Fishing, for example, for 12 years. No one anticipated, people thought he might delay it for a year or 2, but 12 years, that's unbelievable. And it shows how little feeling he's got for our coastal communities. Then the ostensible objective is to improve our trading prospects by making it easier to export farm produce to Europe. Well, Europe exports 5 times as much farm produce to us as we do to them. So if trading obstacles, even now there are no tariffs or quotas, are serious, it's a greater benefit to them to remove them than it is to us. Moreover, and this is what really amazes me, the entire political class seems to have forgotten that we signed a deal with France and about 90 other countries under the WTO to facilitate movement of what's called SPS goods that are liable to these sanitary and phytosanitary rules. And that says quite clearly that countries may not use checks as a concealed form of protection, which is what France in particular, but the EU have been doing. And they're obliged to accept, without border checks, imports from countries which have substantially the same, even if not identical, standards. Well, we actually have identical standards. So they've been breaking the agreement we have. And Starmer's saying, well, let's have another agreement that they'll commit to. Well, they're obviously not very reliable on this subject. And we can be pretty sure that there will be obstacles put in the way of farm produce from time to time. In any case, it's only about 1 or 2% of our total exports. So even if it improved it by 10%, we're talking about a trivial increase. Well, no, nothing's ever trivial, but a very, very small increase in our exports. And to do all that just shows he was in the mood for giving things away rather than for achieving things.
Yes, that's what I always try and do my best to give our political opponents the benefit of the doubt, but I can't really get my head around what he was seeking to achieve here. Is it, the cynic in me suggests that he just has a desire to look like a statesman, to international cooperation for international cooperation's sake. So if you can sign an agreement with the EU, that sort of looks good. I mean, what do you think's motivating him? Also, after I know the Conservatives performed badly in the May elections, but he said he was very much listening to the electorate. I don't know which segment of the electorate was particularly keen on this, particularly the electorate that may have moved away from Labour since the election. What do you think his motivation is? Is he just addicted to sort of international cooperation for its own sake?
It's the latter. Yes, he is part of and identifies with the international bureaucratic class. And that was always so before the referendum. And it was a way you felt you were a superior, more intelligent, more socially superior and morally superior person. That was reinforced when the great unwashed, the British public, by a majority voted against being ruled by the bureaucratic class. So since then, he's had even more of a desire to leave behind the sort of people who voted for Brexit, who weren't all actually the less informed and less well educated. They included, to the surprise of the people on the other side in the referendum campaign, enough of the middle classes of intelligent people who've been to universities, as well as people who just instinctively love their own country, to win. So we won despite that the whole weight of the bureaucracy of the opinion-forming classes was trying to defeat it. And he's never forgiven them. He hasn't forgiven the British people, and this is his revenge. Really
interesting. If you were in his shoes, if we had a Lilley-run government at the moment, what would you make of our present relationship with the European Union? Is it as good as we could get, or are there things you would want to change? If you went to the negotiating table with the EU, what would be your demands that you might make concessions for? How do you think our present relationship can be improved? Because I was nearly on a radio discussion program this morning. Ultimately, I couldn't make it, where the question was, is the Brexit debate now over? Well, I think the Brexit debate's now over, but presumably it will be a running story and a political issue about what our precise relationship is with Europe. I mean, it has been for more than 1,000 years. I don't see that coming to an end anytime soon. But are there things that you would like to change about the present status quo between the UK and the EU that would be in our national interest, in your mind?
There are minor things. So the basic trade and cooperation agreement between us and the EU is zero tariffs and zero quotas. You can't get better than that on that front. But there are some regulatory things which would be helpful, like the Europeans not using SPS regulations, checks on food coming in to impede our exports, though it doesn't seem to have had very much effect. On the services side, it would be good if they would give us recognition of equivalence in financial services, as they have to the Americans and others. We are clearly more equivalent than any other financial services center, but they haven't done it. And we've got to realize why these comparatively small, but nonetheless not insignificant problems persist. They are deliberate. There had to be a price which we had to be forced to pay for leaving. Not because they particularly wanted to punish us as an end in itself, but because they wanted to discourage others from doing likewise. I don't think any other countries will do likewise, but they couldn't take the risk. And so there has to be seen to be a cost, even if it's a cost to Europe as well. And most trade interventions do damage both sides. So by not recognizing the equivalence of our financial services system to their own, it means additional costs are imposed when they, as lots and lots of continental companies do, access the London market. They often have to do it through some institution on the continent which wouldn't otherwise exist and at a little cost. And ultimately, they're bearing that cost. So
their approach
we can't really expect them suddenly to concede on these fronts. We should ask them to. We should be polite and friendly and courteous, but we shouldn't say, well, we'll pay any price for something which is not worth very much.
Yeah, I mean, it sometimes strikes me that the EU approach is the beatings will continue until morale has improved. Sometimes seems to be their approach. Simon from London asks, Peter, has Brexit been undone? Do you think the scale of this surrender by the Prime Minister is that dramatic? Simon goes on to say, all the news suggests that exiting the EU deal comes with huge financial penalties if we were to exit it. That's say if a future Conservative government were to pull out of it. And the current EU deal is only the start, i.e. this is just the first move by the Starmer government. Was it all for nothing? Simon asks.
We have got back legislative control over our own laws. We're no longer paying substantial sums into Europe every year. Now, this deal means we will have to pay some sums into, though I don't think they'll be of the order of magnitude we were paying every year, which was 12 billion or more, and would have risen to net and would have risen to something like 20 billion. So we're much better off being outside, having control of our laws, control of our money, control of our borders than we were before. And we could be better off still if we actually exercised that control. If we did use our control of our laws to make our businesses less burdened by regulation than they are. And we haven't done so. There's been great resistance from the civil service, the blob, and the commentariat to any changes in any rule inherited from the EU. Some we have changed, like we changed the laws on using genetically edited crops. That theoretically will make our farmers more efficient and better, and also enable us to sell that technology in developing countries, particularly. It will make we use less pesticides and less herbicides, and our agriculture can be greener and more friendly. We're likely to have to give that up under this deal. So that is a loss of one of the few advantages we've already taken of our freedom. But Brexit was about being free.
Yep.
How we use our freedom is a different matter. It's like, when I got 18, I left home, went to university, I was in charge of my own life. Didn't necessarily meant I used that time and freedom always as well as I might.
Oh, I don't know. It seems to have worked out for you pretty well in aggregate, Peter.
Yeah,
right. Not too bad. But do you think, going to Simon's question, that this is that it now, and Keir Starmer will close the file on this, or are you expecting further summits and agreements that bring us ever closer within the EU orbit, year by year? Perhaps more and more powers will be given away, so that we don't sort of formally rejoin the European Union. I think the Prime Minister, even he would realise that would be electoral suicide, even if it's in his fantasies that we might one day do it. But do you think that we kind of salami slice it away bit by bit, and this is just the first kind of rejoiner move on the chessboard, and others should be expected over the course of this Parliament?
I think the reaction to this will ensure that there's not an attempt for wider agreements, but within this agreement, quite a lot is left vague. So any security arrangements, we were told this was going to give us access to the £180 billion fund that the EU was setting up to borrow money to spend on arms, and that somehow that we get access to it, that presumably only cost by putting in money to that fund. Well, that has become very insubstantial, but there's sort of talk of we'll continue talking and see whether we can make anything of it. So they'll probably work on that. Then there's the free movement of labour, of young people, an opportunity for their people to come here and then offload their youth unemployment, which is much higher than ours, on us, at the very same time that we're trying supposedly to reduce net migration into the country. Again, that's just further talks will be, and they clearly want us and British taxpayers to pay for the university fees of continental students who would like to come to British universities. And far more continentals want to come to British universities than vice versa. And they would like to do it at certainly not paying the normal international price, which people from China and India and Nigeria pay, but the lower price that we do, and preferably underwritten by, as it was when we were members of the EU, by the British taxpayer, so that they got a loan, which they never had to repay once they went home.
Yeah. So Angela Hughes asks, and we'll put up a poll now as well to ask what the audience think. Angela says, can this new treaty that Starmer has signed us up to be overturned if he's voted out of office in 4 years' time. And we've just put up a poll on the screen now. How much do you agree or disagree with this statement? The next government should rescind Starmer's EU deal in its entirety. We want to know whether the audience here strongly agree, don't know, disagree, or strongly disagree. Peter, do you think we could, let's look forward with optimism that on polling day in 2029, a thumping Conservative majority is secured? Could this be a very quick act to just say we rescind it all, or is it going to be a nightmare to extract ourselves from it?
I suspect it will be written in a way that makes it difficult. But the good news is that Kemi has, right from the start, said to the EU, you should be aware that we will not accept this as binding. We will feel free to walk away from it. Now, there may even be bits of it which are minor and harmless and agreeable we won't want to walk away from. But then they may say, well, you can't have those if it's all or nothing. But yes, I'm sure we can walk away from the key elements of it. For example, if they've got free movement, we can stop that. If they're requiring us to pay money into funds for defence, we can stop that. So it's very hard to see how they can create a deal which we can't get out of. Now they no longer have authority over our parliament, effectively.
Sure. Let's move on to an issue which free movement and some of this Brexit stuff is related to. Certainly, it's a separate topic, but a connected one, and that's immigration, which has, become, if you look at the polls, if not the top issue, oftentimes the economy is the top issue, and you're always looking at what the second issue is of the day, which seems to chop and change a lot. But immigration is well up there now as a high motivator of people's voting preferences. I suppose we should sort of start with the mea culpa on this. Is why do you think the last Conservative government, post-Brexit in particular, got this so wrong? Taking back control of our borders obviously doesn't imply in and of itself whether you have a lax or a strict immigration policy. But nevertheless, Tory manifesto after Tory manifesto was pledging to keep the numbers down to the tens of thousands, I think was the terminology. It spiraled enormously beyond that. What do you put that down to? Did we take our eye off the ball? Did we get some rule wrong? Did we make assumptions that turned out to be false? Why did it spiral so high?
When Tony Blair decided to open our borders to European migration, even though when the new member states joined from Eastern Europe, the existing member states had the right to maintain immigration controls, we, Ireland and Sweden, were the only countries that said we'd open our border to immigration from the new member states. When he did so in a major speech to the CBI, and with the support of the CBI, arguing it was essential that mass migration was good for growth, indeed essential for growth, and that it would fill vacancies. It was essential to fill vacancies. I wrote a pamphlet at the time, which I think is one of the best surviving pamphlets that I've ever written, because everything I said then is still absolutely true. That far from boosting growth, mass migration would undermine it. For two reasons. The only things that create growth are more investment per head and more skills for your indigenous population. And if you allow employers access to cheap, skilled and unskilled labor, they don't invest so much in equipment, and they don't invest, and individuals don't have the incentive to acquire skills. And so we undermine growth. And that was in 2004. He made that speech. We've had 20 years of experience during which we've had the highest rate of immigration in our history, and the lowest rate of growth in a century or more. So, scientifically, he was proven wrong. But we all took it. I didn't take it, but it seemed plausible. It was supported by CBI and business, who, of course, wanted access to cheap labor. It's so much easier than training your own. And it was deemed to be nice and moral, and so all the sort of left of centre people were in favour of it. So we went along with it, and nobody queried it. And those who did query it were immediately labelled racist or economically ignorant. In fact, we were economically wise, and they have created a greater division in our society than anyone could have imagined.
Isn't it even worse than that, Peter, in that it goes far beyond the kind of sort of low-skilled, relatively low-wage part of the economy? I think I've got this number right, but it's from memory, that of the last huge cohort, last year's cohort, 700,000 net migrants, I think 1 million in total, something of that magnitude. Only 16%, 16%, are actually entering the workforce. Now, right, some of those might be Harley Street brain surgeons or Premier League footballers, but I'm presuming a good number of those are relatively low-skilled labour. But that's 84% who aren't even in the workforce, not even low-skilled labour. This seems to be, we're taking on board each year a colossal number of net beneficiaries from the system, whilst also scaring off our brightest people. We've got the biggest outflow of millionaires from the UK of any country in the world other than China. Just on a fiscal level, it seems that we can't cope with it, let alone the impact, negative or positive or neutral, on growth. It's a huge fiscal drain, isn't it?
And the Treasury did publish, I think it was Home Office probably, or Treasury published studies purporting to show that immigrants were net contributors, but only in the short term and only from certain sectors, and only if they were high earnings and if you ignored their dependents and those who come in due course. So it was a very, very biased and artificial thing, but it convinced officials who then convinced ministers, and they went along with it. I mean, it was unforgivable. And the main person in the final wave of immigration who is to blame was Boris. And Boris loved to be loved. And having participated in, to his credit, the Brexit referendum and then won a great election victory on Get Brexit Done, he thought, oh, now I can be popular among the dining rooms of North London and the general liberal intelligentsia by going along with them. But even he, I don't think, realised quite how widely he'd opened the door. Though I know an official who in the Home Office who did warn them right at the early stages that it would be like this.
What sort of approach should the Conservative Party take to this now? Because obviously everybody's pointing the finger at, you had 14 years to sort this out, we'll never trust you again, the numbers exploded, manifesto commitment after manifesto commitment, missed by a country mile. What sort of policy could we adopt that might be taken seriously? I mean, the idea I've floated, I'd be interested in your opinion on this, and it's just a thumbnail sketch. It's not a fully worked out policy, but it goes something like this: that if you divide total government expenditure in the United Kingdom between the roughly 70 million human beings in the United Kingdom, it comes out at £17,250 per person. Now, I mean, that's a generalized average. Of course, young people cost more because they're in schools. Elderly people tend to cost more because they require more care or health treatment and the rest of it. But nevertheless, stone cold average, £17,250 per person. Why don't we have a kind of green card system that says, well, that's fine if you want to come over and work or indeed study medieval poetry at some university somewhere with your wife, 3 kids and great aunt, you're more than welcome. But the annual membership subscription is £17,250 per person. We will need a cheque for that amount up front, and you may make it a bit more a la carte for young people and older people, because not all people cost the state the same. But you need to pay that up front, and you can write that off against any income tax bill at the end of the year. But we need to make sure everybody coming in is washing their face, and the basic sum that would equate to that is £17,250 per person per annum.
They get you with that on 2 grounds. One, when I was in Secretary of State for Social Security, we had a system where people had to put up a bond for people, dependents who were coming to demonstrate they really meant when they said these people would not be a burden on the state. More than half of the people defaulted on their bond. If people are prepared to make promises and not keep them, the idea we could enforce any rule that people had to pay £17,000 a year for the pleasure of being here is for the birds. The second is we shouldn't start from the assumption that we need lots of people. The other fallacy in the original Blair proposal that we needed mass immigration was that we had a shortage of labour. I mean, you're an economist, I'm an economist. We know that in a flexible market, there's no such thing as a shortage because the price moves to the market clearing level. And why there appears to be a shortage is because the wages are held down by the availability of cheap foreign labour. Mm-hmm. But the idea that allowing that labour in fills the vacancies is a nonsense, because every person who comes in, and I'm talking about people who come in and get a job, they fill that job. But if they earn £25,000, they then consume £25,000, and they create as much demand for additional labour as they've initially met. And that's why when Blair made this original speech, he said, there are 600,000 vacancies in this country. We need to open our borders to migration from abroad. We've had millions, literally, of working people come here, ignoring their dependents. And there are now 800,000 vacancies in the country. So clearly doesn't work. And any economist worth his salt could have told you it wouldn't work.
Yeah. Okay, let's turn our attention to another area of controversy where perhaps the Conservatives in opposition are now moving away somewhat from the position that the last Conservative government took, and that's net zero policy, an area where you have been a skeptic and a critic over many years of our approach here. Kemi has signalled a shift away, indeed abandoning the carbon net zero by 2050 target, although it's not obvious entirely that she's abandoned any future target. I think potentially the door is open to let's try and hit it by 2080 for sake of argument. She hasn't completely ruled out there might be a target, but just not 2050 as one of those targets. Why do you think the Conservatives got into this leftist lunacy about carbon net zero, apparently falling for the belief that it's going to create lots of green jobs? I mean, clearly it will create some jobs because government mandates always do that. I always say if you banned the personal computer in Britain, you'd generate lots of jobs for typists, but and typewriter manufacturers, but it wouldn't be very good for the economy, even though you'd be able to point to the fact that factories were opening to make typewriters because we weren't allowed to use personal computers anymore. And that seems to me rather similar about all this green technology. If you make it mandatory that we can only power things through windmills, you'll obviously boost the windmill industry, but it's not to the betterment of GDP as a whole. Again, why do you think we got into this scenario of an unbelievably expensive target that has almost no impact on global emissions? Even, you know, if I could click my fingers like this for free and make Britain carbon net zero now with no damage to the economy, I'd probably do it. But I wouldn't believe that it was going to have any meaningful impact on climate change, given how low our emissions are. How did we get into this trap? And how do we now get out of it and adopt a rather different, more sensible policy in opposition?
Well, I'll tell you why I voted against the Climate Change Act in 2008 when it was introduced by someone called Ed Miliband, funnily enough, because, and I'm a scientist by training, I studied physics at Cambridge. I had no doubt that there's an underlying truth about the whole climate change thesis: double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, it will raise the temperature. But it's always seemed to me, actually, it's quite desirable. The temperature in Britain should be a bit warmer, and the costs and negatives are not catastrophic. But in 2008, they were presented as potentially catastrophic, and any costs of saving the planet from this distant threat were themselves distant and far off. I went, when the bill came out, I went to the vote office to get the impact assessment, the cost-benefit analysis governments are by law obliged to produce when they produce some new legislation, to reassure Parliament that what they're proposing has benefits that exceed the cost. I read actually the officials said, well, you're the only person who's asked for it. We're going to have to cut open the packet. I know I was the only person in Parliament who actually got it, plus my 4 friends. And it said that the potential costs were twice the maximum benefits, and the costs all accrued to Britain, and the benefits of a fractionally lower rise in temperature were spread across the rest of the world. So I thought, well, no intelligent person can vote for this. Whatever your views about climate change, and I was quite prepared to believe there are other ways which would be cost effective of tackling it, but this was not it. But nobody else, throughout the whole debates and the passage in Parliament, discussed the costs and benefits, because the costs were all in the distant future. But the future is now, and the costs are beginning to come home. We now have the highest electricity costs in Europe, and Europe has far higher electricity costs than the rest of the world because it's gone somewhat along the same route as us. And lots more costs are in the pipeline if we have to move prematurely to electric cars and heat pumps and so on. I'm not against all those things. And as a conservative, if we can avoid change, even if the change isn't going to be catastrophic, as a conservative, I don't particularly like unnecessary change. If we can avoid unnecessary and avoidable change at a reasonable cost, we should do so. But as you said, at the moment we produce 0.8% of the world's emissions, but we're bearing disproportionately the costs. The only argument for doing so is that we're setting a lead for the world. The idea that the world is sufficiently stupid to follow us if they see that it's given us high-cost electricity, it's driven our emissions, creating industries overseas, it hasn't reduced emissions in the planet, only those that are coming up smokestacks in Britain, they're not going to do the same. They'll say, oh, these English, they are so, so masochistic.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? On the cost side, I was told by a senior researcher at the Centre for Policy Studies, here's some numbers to conjure with, quite eye-watering, really. If you were to take the average of the Treasury estimate and the Climate Change Committee's estimate, the average of the two, as to what proportion of GDP it would cost us to get to carbon net zero by 2050, it comes out at 86% of present GDP in one given year, 86% of 1 year's GDP.
It's been over.
By way of contrast, I think the cost of fighting the Second World War was 87% of GDP. So it is, as a national endeavour, in pure cost and financial terms, along the same scale. And I would suggest it's not obvious that we face the same existential threat as we did from Hitler's Germany. The rubber is hitting the road on this now. People aren't, I mean, our energy prices are what, 4 times that of the USA, for sake of argument, which, puts us at a colossal competitive disadvantage against our American allies in terms of production, certainly in terms of manufacturing and in a lot of the new technologies. What do you think the Conservatives should do to move away from this? One of Kemi's early and bigger announcements was, as I say, to abandon the 2050 target. But do we need to go a bit further and faster on this? We'll have another poll on this at the moment about what people think. Should we abandon carbon net zero as a concept almost entirely? If we can get there just because of the natural onward march of free market technologies, hurrah. But it doesn't really require a government central plan at all from here on, does it?
I think she did the right thing of saying that it's simply impossible that we'll achieve it by 2050, and any attempt to do so would be ruinously expensive. Therefore, we have to think of alternatives, ways of using our money, and if possible, of course, diminishing emissions if it can be done cost effectively. If we can have cheaper energy by any new forms of producing energy, great. And do you know how you tell whether it's cheaper? It will be able to survive without subsidy. And you just move away from all these subsidies, which, incidentally, when Professor Dieter Helm was asked to carry out an analysis by the last Conservative government of our energy policy, he concluded that we'd spent up to £100 billion unnecessarily by subsidising prematurely immature technologies. So if the cost of solar panels is coming down, the sensible thing is wait until they come down 90% rather than subsidise their use when they've only come down 5%. Mm-hmm. And that's what we were doing. So we're committed long-term by investments we made when some of the technologies, which in due course may become competitive, were wholly and unrealistically uncompetitive. And the way to avoid that in future is say, well, if you've got a good idea, go for it, produce it, but don't expect a subsidy for it.
That's really interesting. It feeds into a question that Mike Fairhurst has asked. Mike asks, what happened to small modular nuclear reactors? Both this government and the previous one seem to let them disappear without a trace. What's your broad take on nuclear, Peter? Do you think that can survive without subsidies? Or I've often heard special pleading made for nuclear, that you sort of need government to get it underway or to underwrite it or such like. And another question, if I may, from John Strafford, this ties in how we might get away from this climate lunacy. But he asks whether the EU can intervene under the new agreement that Starmer has just agreed if we sought to repeal the Climate Change Act. I don't know the answer to that question. So two on this theme, small modular nuclear reactors. I suppose I'll add into that fracking as well. Are you an enthusiast for that? But then John asks, if we try and extract ourselves from this climate change madness, might the EU be able to prevent us?
Well, I'll deal with that latter point first, because in the Starmer surrender deal, there is a very clear statement that we are committed, Britain is committed to pursuing the reduction in carbon emissions at least as rapidly as the EU.
At least as rapidly.
At least as rapidly. So if we stick with that agreement, we are saying we must be the most costly country in the world to produce energy. Now, that is obviously something we should get out of as quickly as possible. But on small nuclear, when I was on the Environment and Climate Change Act the Energy and Climate Change Act in the House of Commons, I persuaded the committee, because I bumped into someone at Rolls-Royce and talked about it, to do a study of small modular reactors. And they did, and we were brought in favor of them. And that was 2013, I think. And, here we are 12 years later, and the government is saying, oh, well, later in the year, we'll tell you which of the options that have been put forward we think is most attractive. Well, there is this lack of dynamism and drive in the civil service and officialdom about this, which is criminal. Because had we gone ahead with it and if the studies show that the whole thing is uneconomic, then don't do it. But make that decision speedily rather than go over it in such a languorous way that by the time we do it, other people will be ahead of us.
Yeah, it seems
now, the key thing about nuclear is that it's a wonderful system for base load, but not so good for oscillating up and down. And so if you try and have it with wind and solar, it doesn't really work. It's either or. If you can make wind and solar work and have some other means of filling in the gaps when the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, fine. But nuclear's not it. And if you've got nuclear, then there's no point in having wind and solar. So we ought to go ahead with it if it is economic as fast as possible. And it's the one consequence of net zero which might lead to creating jobs, producing goods which we could sell to the rest of the world, technology we could sell to the rest of the world. We're never going to sell windmills, we're not going to sell solar panels. That's all shit garbage when Miliband says it's going to create green jobs. But theoretically, we could create nuclear jobs. I originally wanted to be a nuclear scientist, which is why I studied science at Cambridge. And then, because by 1965, we had more nuclear capacity in this country, civil nuclear capacity for producing electricity, than the whole of the rest of the world put together. And I decided, oh, well, actually, they didn't need my help, so I did other things.
Very wide. Yeah, it does seem to take forever to get anything done in Britain. And isn't there that great Nick Clegg quote? I can't remember the exact dates, but when he became Deputy Prime Minister in 2010, he said, no point in discussing nuclear. It wouldn't come on stream until 2025. Well, it's now 2025. I might have got the dates slightly wrong, but it was about
2022, I think, was his thing that was far too far ahead. Well, we'd have had some benefit from it by now.
Just to let you know the results of our first poll, as I say, not claiming this is representative of the population, but we asked you whether the next government should rescind Starmer's EU deal in its entirety. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? 81% of you strongly agreed, 13% agreed, 6% don't know, 0% disagree and 0% strongly disagree. Very good to have such a sound audience with us.
Just the intellectual cream of the nation.
Quite right too. We have nothing less than that at PopConversations, Peter, as you well know. I want to move on to another area which I can recall when you were our Secretary of State for Social Security, and that's about welfareism, really. If we're looking to get government expenditure back into balance, we haven't had a balanced budget run by any government of any stripe since 2001. It's difficult to look beyond the welfare bill, isn't it? I mean, the Department of Work and Pensions total bill is completely colossal now. I know the state pensions are about half of it, there or thereabouts, but it goes inexorably upward to a remarkable lack of effect. I mean, I think I worked out, I'm including state pensions in it, which is a little bit of a cheat code, I guess, but it's something like our total welfare bill, total transfer payments amount to something like £11,000 per household per year in Britain. It's something of that sort of magnitude. You would have thought for £11,000 per household per year, we would have easily eliminated poverty by now, wouldn't you? I mean, as Ronnie Reagan was famous for saying, somewhere there must be some overhead. It seems to me that we have rather lost, and I don't just mean the Conservative Party, I mean the country as a whole, the sort of swashbuckling zeal that we had back in the days of Peter Lilley as Secretary of State for Social Security, that we need to praise work, be critical of idleness, make sure that the incentives in the system, whilst providing a safety net, don't provide a comfort blanket, and that people are inclined to go out and work more. I mean, for example, Jane Winkles asks, many people in receipt of universal credit want to work more hours, but if they do, they quickly lose some of their benefits, thus work does not pay. How can we encourage people to work? If you were what's now called Secretary of State for the Department of Work and Pensions rather than Social Security, what would your approach be now? This seems to me the most colossal area of government expenditure that any future serious Conservative government would have to tackle very seriously and reduce expenditure markedly.
Absolutely right. It's the one area where we can potentially do the right thing and save money, because actually it ought to be a moral imperative to get people back to work, because it's in their interests, not least if they are suffering from depression or anxiety. The best cure for that is having a job. Mm-hmm. The worst thing is to sit languishing at home. When I took over Social Security, rather to my surprise, in 1992, I looked at the budget. It had grown twice as fast as national income for 50 years since the creation of the welfare state. It had become the biggest element in public expenditure, bigger than the next three departments put together. And therefore, I looked through it item by item and thought we must, particularly those which were growing fastest, we must tackle. And the biggest fast-growing area was, as it is now, invalidity benefit. And the number of people on that benefit had trebled in a decade, even though there was no increase in illness and sickness in the country as a whole. And it was clear that this was because people could get onto it by getting a doctor's note from their own doctor. And doctors very often said they thought they had a moral obligation to give any of their patients who asked for it a note putting them on it. So we replaced that by a system relying on authentication of their illness by doctors employed by the department. And I knew it would be terribly unpopular, and I wrote a letter to the Prime Minister explaining that it would cause absolute ructions. We'd find, good Conservatives were on this benefit, and they'd greatly resent if they were labelled as people who were scrounging a benefit unnecessarily. And it was called the warts and all letter, and it had to be, first of all, cleared with the department lawyers and before being sent to the Prime Minister, so that he'd know what was going to be in store. My private secretary came in to see me as ashen-faced and said, "Secretary of State, I don't know how I'm going to tell you, but that warts and all letter has been accidentally sent to the Press Association." And it turned out there was one difference in the digits of the telephone number between our lawyers and the Press Association. It wasn't, as I initially assumed, an attempt to end my career abruptly. And it seemed terrible. And I had to go off and do 18 interviews on the trot over the weekend. But each interview got easier because people started phoning up the radio stations and the TV studios and saying, and about bleeding time too. Why didn't Lilley do something about this before? The man next door is training for the Olympic team and he's on invalidity benefit, and so on and so forth. And by the time Parliament reassembled on the Monday, the whole mood had changed. And the Prime Minister went and spoke to Parliament entirely, endorsed what I was going to do, and it went through. We tend to underestimate the extent to which people want to see policies which get people back into work, even including those who perhaps have exploited the loopholes in the system. Now they know it's unsatisfactory. Very few people actually, are some, but very few people that say, oh, I'm going to live on benefit. What happens is they're working, they lose their job, perhaps through their own fault, perhaps through the firm going bankrupt. They found themselves unemployed. Unemployment pays pretty low in this country. The idea that it's an incentive not to work is nonsense. But they get on it. Their whole expectations are diminished. They get used to a low standard of life. They then find that they can supplement it if they can get sickness benefits or invalidity benefit or incapacity benefit, as the case may be, or now whatever it is, personal payments. And that sort of raises them back up a bit. They're still living pretty modest lives compared with what they would have got had they remained in work or what they could do. There's no way you can incentivize them back into work by saying, oh, we'll give you an in-work benefit or we'll reduce the value of your out-of-work benefits. You've got to say, actually, you've got no choice. If you can work, you must work. You've got to be available for work. You've got to be willing to take work. And if a job is available, you've got to take it. And then they'll get back to work and they'll feel much better about it too.
Yeah. Do you think more needs to be done on the, I mean, I know Ian Duncan Smith's reforms on universal credit went some way to tackling this sort of cliff edge effect, that there were certain circumstances where if you went into work, you would end up being poorer because of the scale of benefits withdrawal. And it's always struck me that Conservatives who argue that high marginal rates of tax at the top end of the income spectrum disincentivise work should apply the same logic to the lower end of the income spectrum. Who's going to get off their sofa and go and work, I don't know, in a fish and chip shop if they're actually going to be worse off doing so? But they might also not do that unless they can be compelled or obliged because of the leisure gap. Right. I mean, if your choice is working 40 hours a week, potentially quite tough, manual, boring labour and getting, I don't know, sake of argument, £15,000 a year after tax, or sitting on your sofa, watching television, playing computer games, getting up when you want for, let's say, £13,000 a year, the leisure benefit you might calculate, even if it's not in your long-term interest from a mental health perspective or a career ladder perspective, you might calculate, well, it's much nicer to stay at home and watch television than it is to go and be a toilet cleaner or a road sweep or some such like. Do you think that we should perhaps adopt the sort of approach that was introduced by Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin, that he basically tackled it from the leisure side? He said, look, if you're on benefits and are able-bodied, that's fine. But in broad terms, I simplify, but you'll have to turn up at the park gates at 8 o'clock every weekday morning. And we'll expect you to pick up litter, clean graffiti away and all of the rest of it. And my understanding was that Governor Walker's initial aim was, look, if these people are on welfare, we might as well get something out of them, cleaner buildings and less litter in the park. What actually happened was that by perhaps not week 2, but by week 3, 4, 5 or 6, the number of people turning up at the park gates completely diminished, because suddenly that job in the local fish and chip shop or the local McDonald's or in the private sector became more attractive than turning up at the park gates at 8 o'clock every morning. So he tackled it by taking a vast amount of leisure and having a modest income, if you're able to work, is just not possible. You're going to need to be at the park gates 8 a.m. till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday. So you might want to go and find something else to do. And sure enough, huge switch of people who weren't in the labour force, initially through the gateway of the state scheme and then into the private sector.
So, I mean, we did introduce the first elements of workfare, as it was called, when I was Secretary of State and Gillian Shepherd was Secretary of State for Employment. We were actually trying to create sort of make work schemes for unemployed people. Is very expensive, the organisational. But we thought, well, for those who've been unemployed for a year or more, it's worth bearing that cost. A, there are fewer of them, and B, they clearly need the greatest incentive to go back to work. And if we can create work for them, they will do it. It will get them back into the habit of work, and they may find that they go do a proper job elsewhere. We found, as Governor Walker, that a lot of people simply didn't turn up, that they suddenly found that well, when I say didn't turn up, by not turning up, they forewent benefits. In other words, they probably have been working and getting benefits. And they decided in future it's better to work with no benefits than to get the modest benefits you've got on the workfare scheme.
Yeah.
And that's wonderful. They went back on the straight and narrow, and the taxpayer saved some money, and they probably felt better for it. So there is an element where you can do that. Frank Field did advocate the turn up for work at least several days a week, or turn up at the benefits office several days a week, as much to discourage people who were really working as to discourage people who enjoyed the leisure, as you put it.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on, because we haven't got long to go. We've rattled through the best part of an hour, but there's lots of questions on this as well. The present state of the Conservative Party. Where do we go from here? You've got experience of us being in opposition as well as at the height of government. And, you know, it's pretty bleak, isn't it? I mean, we took an absolute beating at the July general election. I think our lowest share of the vote since democracy began, 121 MPs, a pitiful number to be sitting in the Conservative interests. And then, if anything, it seems to have got a bit worse in the 10 months since. That had the May local elections, I'm using John Curtis's algorithm here, been a general election and people had typically voted in the same way, the Conservatives would have got 15% of the vote and I think 17 members of Parliament. The opinion polls are a disaster. I think the last opinion poll I saw put us on 16% of the vote, suggesting that John Curtis was about right, in fourth place, just behind the Liberal Democrats, and way behind this new insurgent party, Reform, who are, I think, were on 29% of the vote. It all looks not just bleak, but potentially existential. What's your view on how panicked Conservatives should be, Peter? Have we seen it all before and it's patience that's needed? Or is a rather stronger dose of some sort of medicine and rehabilitation needed in order to get the Conservative Party back on its feet? I mean, we seem to be miles away from any prospect of winning a general election at the moment.
It's extremely, depressing and difficult. And I'm a fan of Kemi. I've known her since 2006, and I think if anyone can rescue us from this, it will be her. But it's going to be extremely difficult. I was a wannabe candidate in 1977 when Mrs. Thatcher had been the leader for 2 years. Still 2 years off before election, she was in opposition. And the one thing I learned is that Conservatives tend to be terribly timid and cautious and panic in opposition, and they tend to be overconfident in power. We've got to be very aware that we mustn't panic. We've got to be behind the leader. The idea of a leader is just fatuous and absurd. And I hope she will develop a sense of momentum by more announcements like that on net zero, not coming out with fully fleshed policies, but saying that I've got a group here working on that. These are the parameters within which it's working on growth, on immigration, already on net zero, on social security reform and so on. And we've got to be seen to develop policies because they're the sort of policies that will be needed by an incoming government in 2029, not because they're in response to an opinion poll or a bad local election result. If they're done in the latter way, without a coherent rationale, people would say, yeah, you didn't do it last time, you don't really believe it this time, it won't happen. Mm-hmm. If we can show that we've got a really solid rationale for what we're proposing, people might believe us. But until we do that, then they won't believe us. And therefore, our recovery won't take place. We can have some confidence, however, that it is possible to recover. As I say, in 2017, I was applying for a seat where they had a primary, and I had to go spend weeks going around with several other candidates who wanted to be the prospective parliamentary candidate, talking to all the Conservatives and Conservative activists in Hemel Hempstead, and it was hard to find more than 1 in 10 who thought that Mrs. Thatcher would still be the leader by the time of the next general election. She was terribly unpopular. And among activists, they just sort of didn't think that she got it. And even fewer who thought she'd win a general election if she was still leader. So we mustn't panic. We must back the leader, and she must, and I'm sure will, come up with policies which are well argued rather than opinion poll tested.
That's really interesting. Do you think there's more of an opportunity that perhaps she hasn't seized yet, but might seize, where you can take very clear Conservative positions on things without necessarily having the full peer-reviewed 200-page immaculate policy document about exactly how you're going to do it? So you could commit, I mean, she has certainly moved in this direction to abandoning carbon net zero without necessarily having worked out what you're going to do with any renewable contracts that you inherit. Are you going to cancel them, or are you going to honour them, or are you going to honour half of them, all of the rest of it? You could commit, for example, to an overall reduction in the tax burden as a proportion of GDP without actually specifying whether you would do that by increasing income tax thresholds or reducing corporation tax. You could take a general position. You could commit to abolishing the BBC licence fee, but to say that it's to be worked out whether it would become a subscription service or parts of it would be privatised or all of it would be privatised. Seems to me you can stake out some positions of what you're going to achieve and then actually say, well, obviously there's going to have to be a year or 18 months of detailed policy work on this. And I'd like to see a bit more of that, I think, to admit that we haven't got the detail, but nevertheless, we're going to abandon carbon net zero. We're going to have this approach to immigration. I'd like us to leave the ECHR, for example. The BBC I just picked out, as it strikes me as a very obvious one that we could commit to, even if you want to work through the details of how you would unravel the corporation if it were no longer to be structured this way. I would have thought we could announce those sort of positions on a kind of weekly, fortnightly basis and then do the policy work in the background over the next 18 months or so.
As Thatcher, again, I tend to think back to that period, which was formative as far as I was concerned. I wasn't in politics, but I was working for in my spare time. And she had set up initially the Right Approach. The group who produced a document called The Right Approach, which came out with actually what was a critique of the Labour government, but it was presented as Conservative policy and was treated by the commentariat as Conservative policy. There's very little precise and detailed policy, but by saying what the Labour Party is doing here is wrong, giving into the trade union is wrong, you've got to have some sort of reform of the trade unions, but did not spell it out at all. And then a year later came the Right Approach to the Economy. Again, broad themes, clearly in line with Conservative principles, restated. After all, been through a whole Heath period when the government had taken greater control of every price, wage, dividend, fare in the country. We have more control over the prices in the British economy than the Stalin did in the Soviet economy. So moving away from Ted Heath to something more traditionally Conservative was quite a huge change. And she didn't even have a majority in her shadow cabinet. And I think actually has got a party which is becoming united again. It was terribly divided in the last time, but I think it'll be more united. She's going to carry it with her. But doing that sort of thing, saying, for example, on immigration, looking back under Mrs. Thatcher, 12 years in government, what was the level of immigration during her 12 years? Exactly net zero, by chance. We should say, we would like to get back to that level. We can't tell you how soon or how fast at this stage, but that is an objective, and we'll do it by reducing the number of visas we offer every year. Labour governments refuse to do that. That sort of thing gives you a sense of direction, but you still clearly got a lot of detail to work out before the next election. What we must avoid doing is making lots of sort of uncosted pledges which sound good, but to cut this tax and that tax and the other tax, when, frankly, we're going to inherit a pretty grim position, even if the Labour government is moved to do some of the right things before the end of this Parliament, simply by the fact that the economy is in such dire need of reform that they may well be forced to, as was Harold Wilson, or rather Jim Callaghan, before Mrs. Thatcher came in. Jim Callaghan was actually forced by the IMF to cut the budget of the NHS, the only leader and party which has ever done so. And they may find themselves in similar circumstances before the end of this Parliament.
On net zero, we asked the audience, should the Conservative Party should commit to abandoning net zero targets entirely. Strongly agree 80%, agree 17%, don't know 0, disagree 3%, strongly disagree 0%. So again, amongst our audience, quite an overwhelming majority there, but not unanimous. Peter, the difference between the Conservative Party, the plight of the Conservative Party now and it finding itself in opposition in 1974 and again in 1997, obviously the first of those was a fairly rapid turnaround and march back to power. And in 1997, an incredibly long march back to power. In fact, up until 1997, only one person who had been leader of the Conservative Party failed to go on to be Prime Minister. It was basically nailed on, if you were leader of the Conservative Party, that you would be Prime Minister at one point. Austen Chamberlain was the only counterexample to that. Between 1997 and us finally getting back into office, we had 3 consecutive leaders who did not become Prime Minister. So the total number of Tory leaders who didn't become PM quadrupled in that long period of time of turning things around. But now we've got another problem, and a good number of people have asked about this. So I'll finish by asking you about this. Chris Penny, Brian M, and Phil Dixon all ask, what can we do about Reform UK? This is a big difference to being, I don't know, 25, 30% behind Tony Blair's government in the late 90s or the early noughties. We've now got the new kids on the block who are in many ways competing on the same sort of ground. There are big differences between Reform and Conservative, but seem to be competing on the same ground remarkably successfully. What would your approach be to Reform and Nigel Farage? Embrace them, ignore them, criticise them? How should we deal with this phenomenon, which is not unique to the UK? New populist right of centre parties are popping up everywhere. It just seems that the British iteration is Reform UK.
Oh, we have to win back the respect of the British people and the trust of the British people. And we won't do that just by attacking other people. Of course, we should attack the government because that's our constitutional duty. And in the process of attacking the Labour Party, we can make it clear that there's an alternative to what's being done and that we are it. We will be able to differentiate ourselves, I think, from or rather, we will be different from Reform. We won't seek to be different from Reform, in that they will go for populist policies that just simply don't stack up. To their credit, they did break with the consensus on immigration to some degree, though if you look at what Nigel Farage used to say, you say, of course, we've got to have it, immigration for the health service and for social care and for skills which we needed, which was accepting the whole doctrine that there are shortages you intrinsically need to fill from abroad, which was nonsense. But at least they questioned some of the consensus on immigration. They begun to question the consensus on net zero, but that wasn't a major part of their thing. So if we come up with credible policies in these areas, and they have incredible policies supplemented by all unbelievable promises of giveaways, which is what they say, they're going to raise the basic tax allowance to £20,000 and it costs £200 million. I forget how much it's going to cost. They will discredit themselves and they won't be doing the country any good. I think it's much better to start off by saying, we're going to tell the truth and commit, and internalize that objective. And then you'll carry conviction than saying, oh, we're going to differentiate ourselves from that party on this bit and that party on that bit. And people will say, oh, that's a fraudulent approach. And Mrs. Thatcher, when she was leader, she was persuaded by John Hoskins and Norman Strauss, two businessmen who went to Sarah and said, "We're going to be your private office." And they wrote the so-called stepping stones document. It said, you've got to start with what the country will need when you're elected. There's no point in getting elected unless you're able to tackle the problems. And then you've got to spell out the mandate you will need, because if you commit yourself not to do things that are necessary or to do things which are damaging, you won't be able to solve the problems. And then you've got to say, how do we persuade people that mandate is right? And that's the way she approached it. And I'd like to see Kemi stand up and say very publicly, that's what we're going to do. We're working out the problems, and it's clear what the problems are even now. We're going to tackle them. And we appreciate some of those things will be unpopular. It's our task between now and the next election to persuade people they're necessary, and that we'll be the party that can carry it through. And I think people will say, gosh, what a change, both for the Conservative Party and for the whole political spectrum, to have someone who doesn't just look at focus groups or say things that go down well in the pub, but is doing the right thing because she believes it.
Interesting you say that. I mean, I should say I personally voted for Robert Jenrick in the leadership election, but have been a long-standing fan of Kemi. And I say this just a statistic that people might want to conjure with. Probably the most trigger-happy sector of getting rid of people in the entire British economy are Premier League football teams. If you look at Premier League football teams from 2016 onwards, on average, a Premier League football team fires its manager every 750 days. Every 750 days. That's the trigger-happy Premier League football team for you. The Conservative Party, since 2016, has fired its leader on average every 700 days, even more trigger-happy than a Premier League football board. But I should say, on the health of the Conservative Party, whilst the Conservative Party is in deep trouble at the moment, it's very likely to recover. Well, this is one which has divided our audience somewhat. 18% strongly agree it will recover. 28% agree it will recover. Don't know 25%. Disagree 22%. Strongly disagree 7%. So a bit more concern over the long-term recovery of the Conservative Party, but perhaps with some smart and sensible thinking, Peter, as you have outlined over this hour. I'm sorry we've overrun our time. We'll get there. And to help us to get there, if you would like to join us for future Pop Conversations, we've got a couple of weeks off. But you can, there's a link in the chat where you can click to get more details. On June the 9th at 7 p.m, I'll be in conversation with Shadow Home Secretary Chris Philp. And on the 23rd of June at 7 p.m, I'll be in conversation with Robert Jenrick, our Shadow Justice Secretary. So 2 more great events to join up for there. Thank you to all of you who have joined us for this Pop Conversation with one of my political heroes, Peter Lilley. I think he brings wisdom, clarity and calm, which is much needed in British politics and the Conservative Party at the moment. And Peter, thanks very much to you. It's been fascinating. We've covered a vast range of topics. More power to your elbow. I hope your approach is listened to, not just by the wider Conservative Party, but our current leader too. It's been a real pleasure, Peter. Thank you so much.
Sure. And it's good to talk to such an informed, intelligent and wise audience.
Thanks to all of you who have been on the call. Hope to see you again soon. Have a great evening. Over and out.